Hello and welcome to the Fedora Files. I am Gregory Fedora, and this is my podcast where I discuss all kinds of things, slices of life, things that I find exciting and interesting, everything from cryptozoology, paranormal, to just going on a balloon ride or even learning about hats or whatever. What I find interesting, I think you'll find it interesting too. It's a little slice of life because there's just way too much jaded stuff out there. So we're just here to enjoy life and show you some things that you may not know or have ever thought about. And with me is my good friend Chip Stetson, who is
How you doing?
also a fellow investigator here at the Cryptozoological Research Team. He's more of the paranormal side. He's into the ghosts and goblins, whereas I'm into the creatures. But we work together and do a lot of stuff together. And thank you, Chip, for
Uh,
being.
I'm glad to be here. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So we got an interesting story or case to discuss. It's considered an unsolved one in that there's never been any explanation for what has happened. No one has ever come forward uh, saying that it was a hoax. No one knows what it was or where it went or anything. It's just and the police investigated it and they're like, what was this? And we're talking about the big muddy monster of Illinois, of Murfreesboro, Illinois. So it's pretty exciting, I think.
Well, I might be like a lot of people that are, watching or listening. I'm not quite familiar with what the muddy monster is. So, could you go over a little bit of the history of what it is, when it was sighted? Just give us a little information on it.
Yeah, I can. I will right now. In fact, I can tell you a little bit like the description of it. We'll go over that first. It's roughly, they say, between 7 to 8 feet tall with white fur covered from head to toe. It's large. It is also very boisterous and loud and slightly aggressive. Um, but the thing that is distinct, it was just covered in mud. It was white fur, but just muddy, and that's where it got its name, the Big Muddy Monster. Um, the big incidences occurred in 1973, which is almost 50 years ago, and that's the most famous. And like I said, it was unsolved to this day. Um, One of the interesting things about it was the first people to come forward was this couple, and they were married to other people, and they were having a rendezvous, as it were, a little indiscretion, because I guess they weren't getting enough at home. So they got together, and as they were doing what they do down at this place called, I believe, let me see, I wrote it down because I thought this was interesting. Uh, they were at a place called River Park in Murfreesboro. They saw this thing. It freaked them out enough to go to the cops and report the incident. And what's interesting about that is in 1973, if you were having an extramarital affair, it was not something you wanted to get out there. Like nowadays, everybody's doing it. It's like on TMZ every week, and everyone's just like, oh, well. But back in 1973, that was kind of a big deal where, if you were cheating on your wife and husband, you didn't go to the cops and say, hey, I saw something that was like a Bigfoot. You're not going to let that out there because now it's a police report. Now the lawyers can get it and say, well, you were getting busy at River Park. Of course they win the divorce. So, I mean, that was something there that I found interesting, that someone was willing to risk their marriage and everything to report this. So that's an interesting part of it. It The big incident was over 2 days. It was June 25th and June 26th. The next day, a 5-year-old reported seeing the same thing. It scared this child so much, it ran in the house, told the mother. The police went to the woods. There, they found footprints, some kind of substance on some leaves and twigs that had a horrendous smell. And that's interesting in that a lot of times, not necessarily Bigfoots, but like a skunk ape down in Florida is known to leave a horrid smelling residue. Uh, and this muddy monster did the same thing. They called out a canine unit. This is how big this thing got. They got canine units from area police to search for this thing, because now, by this time, now there was about 10 different eyewitnesses of what this was. Well, the canine units chased this thing down, or were hunting it, and the dogs stopped at this barn and were going nuts, but they would refuse to go into the barn. Well, the police finally did go in, and then they saw that the door on the other side was open, and whatever it was had left. Um, but the dogs were afraid to go in. So if it was a person in a costume, dogs would be like going forward. But like if it's a predatory thing, dogs are gonna sense it. And so they reacted in a way that there was some sort of predator within the barn and they were afraid to go in. So I mean, these are police dogs, so they're used to jumping on people and biting them and tearing down, grabbing their groin. I've seen it. It's excruciatingly scary looking. I never want it to happen to me.
Mm.
But these dogs are trained for this, but they were afraid to go in. And this is on the police reports that happened. And
Well, you were saying that it was similar to skunk monster down in Florida, and
yes.
the description sounds almost Yeti-ish, with it being white fur. What are the similarities, or what are the differences between the creatures that
Well, like I said, the similarities are its size, the fur, uh, the elusiveness of it, that they were unable to catch it. One of the key differences of pretty much this in other like Sasquatch or Bigfoots or Yetis or skunk apes, all those things, is that those are more. They seem to be afraid of humans. Where when a human comes at it, they kind of evade and go, where this seemed aggressive. It came towards the people, and it was seemed angry, and like and it basically scared a lot of people. It was coming at them when people ran, then it would leave. The other thing, it was very loud, and um, the police reported that when they were searching for it, at one point they heard this loud noise that they could not identify, like a screaming yell, but it wasn't human like at all. But it was very loud, and they couldn't figure out what was making it. And that's when the canines were trying to find it. They heard this noise, and it sounded angry, and what they said, it was very scary sounding. It was very worrisome to them. And so they were just kind of like, what is this? And they didn't know. And
Well, I found it interesting that um, the main sighting was in '73, because that's the year that both of us were born. So I don't know if
yes,
there's any connection or not, but
yeah, it's a, yes, we both emerged from the Play-Doh Fun Factory of life that year.
yes,
Um,
we did.
yes,
um, Now, was that the earliest sighting of this, or is it something that's been around for a while?
well, that's one of the interesting things. The police chief, well, who he became the police chief, but at the time he was a police officer, and then he became the police chief, and now he's retired. Um, and I can't recall his name right now, but he recently retired like 2, 3 years ago.
Oh,
But
wow.
he talked about how when the incident occurred in '73, he was going through some files and he came across a report in the same area in 1950, and that a man came to the police, reported the same creature, like verbatim, described it the same way these other people had described it. Now, the reason it didn't make any news, or the police didn't really put any mind into it, and the newspapers didn't talk about it. I mean, this got into the newspapers, even into New York. The New York Times reported on it, just a little blip, but it got in there because it was such a big deal. But in 1950, the man who saw it was known as like the town drunk, like he was a drunkard. So he reported seeing this thing, and he said that it attacked his home, and they kind of just like, okay, the guy was drunk, which is understandable. If you're known for being a drunkard and then you report seeing something crazy, it's probably a little bit, too much of that.
A giant
So
pink rabbit, that sort of thing.
yeah, but then 20 years, 23 years later, the same thing emerges. They see it again, and it was a identical identification or description, as it were. So it really messed with people's head, especially this police officer who went, and he was with the team with the dogs, and then later found this report and was like, oh my gosh, this is way too coincidental. And so that's one of the interesting things on that.
Well, so we've just established that it was found in the 1950s, or seen in the 1950s, and also in 1973. Have there been any more recent sightings of it,
Now,
like currently?
well, a few years ago in the early 2000s, some people reported hearing things. They didn't see anything, but again, it was a noise, and it was a couple hunters who had heard this thing, and they did not know what it was, but they were avid hunters. So they knew the noises of of the woods, and this was a noise that they were unsure what it was. Uh, they didn't really go searching. They just reported to the, I guess, the local the rangers in the area, like, hey, we heard something. It might be a hurt animal or a person, and no one ever found anything. But it was a noise that they couldn't just discern what it could have possibly be. But they said it was a very gut wrenching noise, and it frightened them. They just were unclear what it could have been. No one has seen this creature again, but it again, this area, there's a lot of wooded areas, and so a lot of times maybe people have seen it and don't realize it. There's a lot of times where people, your mind, when you see something, will try to make it make sense.
Right.
So they'll see a large creature bounding through the woods and be like, that is a bear. And it's like, oh, is a big muddy white bear. I know there aren't white bears here in Illinois, but this one must be. It's an old bear.
It's not mine. Yeah.
Yeah, so they don't know that. So our minds do that a lot of times. I mean, the same thing. Sometimes our mind sees things and we see things that aren't there, and like we want to say, "Oh, that was a Bigfoot." When that, but then when you get over there, there's no tracks, and of course, it's going to leave some kind of tracks. But
Now, it doesn't seem like it's, I don't know, a very popular monster. Is there anything that's being done that's going to be getting it out there so the public is more aware of it? A
yeah,
PR.
it really is. It's one of the lesser known large cryptids. Like there's other cryptid creatures that people don't know about, but this is one that, like, it's on the size of Bigfoot, and usually those get out there. People know about it, but
Right.
because the incident happened back in the 70s and really only noises have been since, it hasn't been out there. But there's a man named Joseph Terry who is doing a documentary, began doing it about a year and a half ago. And it's
Oh,
supposed to debut this year, in fact, on a streaming service. And when I find out where it is, I will be sure to let everyone know this is where you can watch it. I'll actually probably watch it and tell you my thoughts on it. But he's been filming it for the past year and a half, 2 years, and he's supposed to be coming out this year.
do we know if he's got a lot of evidence or anything like that, or have we
I,
heard anything about what he's going to be releasing, or
well,
just?
I saw the trailer. You can find it on YouTube. You can type it in. If you type in Big Bunny Monster Trailer 2021, you can watch the trailer. And he seems to have a lot of interviews. He interviewed the police chief. He interviewed a lot of the eyewitnesses that are still alive, and talked with them, and they told their stories. And he found some other people who have come forward that say they have seen it since then. But those kind of things, it's hard to say, oh yes, they must have. I mean, I try to believe everyone, but of course they could be like, oh, there's a film crew, I want to tell my story, so they
Yeah,
come up with a story. But
yeah.
like, I try to stick to the ones where there is some, proof, like there's a police report, there's eyewitness, or some sort of photograph or anything, or multiple eyewitnesses telling the same story. It's easier than like Johnny over here sees a camera crew. What do you feel? Oh yeah, big money. I saw it 2 days ago. It was like in my backyard playing, you know, uh, cornhole or whatever. And so,
Well, it is Illinois.
yeah, exactly. So that's the was that. Is that the Hoosier state or is that Indiana?
Indiana has
They're
the
all the same there in the
yeah, it's the
Midwest.
Midwest. Everybody
Horns
plays
and pigs
cornhole.
and big muddy monsters. You probably just offended the whole Midwest.
Well, you can't
That's
get
all.
offended by the truth.
Well, you're from there, so you
Yeah.
know. So excuse me about that.
Well, I've actually learned quite a bit about this. I'd never heard of it until talking with you about that, and I
Yeah,
appreciate you letting me know about that. But I'm going to have to check out the trailer, and I'm looking forward to coming out and watching it.
yeah, and I understand you're going on some ghost adventures soon, little
Yes, that's
ghost
true.
huntings, and we're gonna talk more about that in another episode. You've recently did one up there in Ohio, and you're going to
I
Texas.
did. Yeah,
Yeah,
I did the Ohio Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, which was pretty interesting. Had a few things that took place while I was there, and then next month I'm going to be heading down to Eureka Springs. And from what I understand, there's a haunted hotel that I'm going to be going to, as well as a few other places. So I'm going to be documenting those, bring them to the show, and we can talk about them when I get back.
Great, great. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us here on the Fedora Files. And please come back as we have more and more interesting topics, and not only paranormal and cryptid and supernatural. I've got some other interesting guests that I think you will all enjoy hearing from. And until next time, stay safe and keep searching.